There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. It's August 16, 2002, when a man named Shane Chartres-Abbott meets a client at South Yarra's Hotel Saville. The 27-year-old is a male prostitute who specialises in sadomasochistic sex. With him, he carries a black bag full of sex toys, including a whip, ropes, condoms and handcuffs. The woman he is meeting, 30-year-old Penny, is not a stranger. She too works in the sex industry. They've met for his services before, but have started to get to know each other, with Penny being one of Shane's only clients to know his real name. She knows what she wants from him, and so the pair check in to room 307, closing the door behind them. By 11:20 the following morning, hotel management discovers that no one has checked out of room 307. One man decides to go upstairs to check if anyone is still there. What took place in that room in the late hours of August 16 and into the early hours of August 17 would set off a series of events that would culminate in murder and the most expensive police investigation in Victoria's history. Did Shane turn into someone else inside room 307? And how can we explain what happened next? I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Walkley Award-winning journalist Adam Shand, the host of Channel 9's Australian True Crime Stories. His podcast, The Trials of the Vampire, investigates the shocking assault of a woman in 2002, whose attacker claimed he was a 200-year-old vampire. It's mid-August 2002 and a hotel manager is waiting for the people in room 307 to check out. And after an hour or so, the hotel manager goes upstairs and walks in on a pretty horrific scene. What does he see?
He sees a young lady we'll call Penny, for legal reasons, who has been the victim of a vicious assault. She is in the shower recess of the room, surrounded by sheets that are covered in blood. She has extensive injuries, including a partial amputation of her tongue. And she is not saying who did it.
And who was Penny? When police started to look into who this person was, what did they discover about what she did for a living, what her place was in Melbourne at the time?
Penny was a Thai lady who'd come to Australia, and she had been a dancer in clubs. She'd also been a stripper and also a prostitute. And for some reason, she decided to engage the services of a young escort called Shane Chartres-Abbott. And they had several meetings, during which time they began to have feelings for each other. So it was going beyond a client-escort relationship. And she was coming out of a very abusive relationship with a guy called Mark Adrian Perry. And there's a sense there that she was trying to make him jealous on some level. He'd been abusive to her, hadn't looked after her, had a string of girls as well. So she was disenchanted with the relationship and looking for something else. And she'd chosen the services of an escort who had a particular speciality, BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadomasochism and so forth. And they were going down a path towards some practices there that I guess would shock a lot of people, but those who were involved in these things would be quite familiar with them. But so she was looking for a break from her life, a reset, and it turned out to be something quite different.
And so she was obviously hospitalised for these extensive and very serious injuries. Did she eventually start talking about who she'd been in the hotel room with, sort of what else had taken place that night?
She said that the male escort, Shane Chartres-Abbott, had been the one that had done that to her. Not because she had any actual memory of the assault, only that he was the last one with her. We've had a good look at this, and we didn't feel that that was an ironclad situation, that there was ways that people could have got into the hotel room, including by a broken back door which had no alarm on it. So there was some doubt over it, but it was sort of pushed to one side because of the nature of the injuries and also the nature of the suspect.
And so this Shane, had he had a history of violence? Was there anything in his past to suggest he was capable of a crime this horrific?
He had never had any incidents of violence that we could find. There was a couple of, I guess you could say, low-level domestic violence incidents with a partner, which weren't dealt with by the law, but there was something there. But all those who knew him saw that as an anomaly. There was no consistent history of violence. He was a gentle, soft guy who was into black magic, superstition, witchcraft, liked a glass of wine, liked his friends, liked dogs, and no one could relate the violence in this so-called attack with this man.
In the podcast, you spoke to some members of his family and some people who knew him. How did they describe Shane's upbringing? What kind of life had he had up until that point?
It was a very unusual family, to say the least. I mean, it wasn't even his name. Chartres-Abbott was a name that his grandfather had adopted from the name of a building in Melbourne, in Collins Street, Chartres House. He was involved in the occult, and he had a series of businesses over a long time where he would call up the dead, he would read tarot cards, he would do anything that he could to make a buck. So he created this identity, Frank Chartres-Abbott, which later became Frank Chartres-Abbott. So he went from town to town selling this sort of black medicine show, if you like, black magic show. And his son, who was also Frank, took on the whole thing as well. He became Francois Chartres-Abbott. So Shane was brought up with an unusual take on reality and truth. And he was very much into this as well. It was in his family tradition. And he read a lot about it. And this is sort of how he drifted into the BDSM world as well, because there was a whole kind of set of rituals around that was very appealing. And he studied under a BDSM master. And those that know that world know it's not about violence. It's actually about trust and the things people do with each other in the confines of their room to get their thrills. But it's not about violence. It's not about hurting someone. It's not about dominating someone to the point where they're afraid and end up like Penny did. So the whole thing was completely out of kilter. And when he was charged with this heinous assault, he went to a lady called Sandra Gibson, who was part of the Prostitutes Collective, and she spent a lot of time with him, and she is absolutely convinced that he wasn't guilty of this. But the thing was, when it hit the papers, here was a guy who claimed to be a 200-year-old vampire, part of the whole family tradition of past lives and the occult and black magic and so forth. So claims to be a 200-year-old vampire, but it's really just part of his escort shtick. People were buying a fantasy, a fiction. But when it hit the press, what it seemed to be was that here's this guy who was bloodthirsty, he'd bitten someone's tongue off, or part of a tongue off, and was drinking blood. You think, well, hang on, he's there to earn money. He's not there to make a heinous assault. So those that were close to him just couldn't see how this could have happened. And I think that was completely overlooked. And I'd covered the story. In 2003, I was in the middle of a gangland war. Literally, I was talking to Carl Williams every day, and there were bodies falling in the streets. I think in that period, every 6 weeks, someone was executed in the streets. In the middle of all this, in 2003, in June, Shane Chartres-Abbott is murdered outside his house. And it just seems like, was this part of the gangland war? Not really. So we all kind of passed over it. And we looked at the earlier story and said, well, he was the 200-year-old vampire. But it was still a shocking thing, of course, when it was the first person, I think, in Victoria's history to be killed on the way to court. So pretty shocking thing.
What was discovered about that night in the hotel room? What did Penny say took place before the attack? Could she remember meeting Shane in the hotel room or what they discussed or anything?
Yeah, that was very sketchy. I mean, she remembered him coming. She remembered there was an argument over money or something, and then nothing, pretty much nothing. And then she wakes up in the hospital and she comes up with a story that he must have assaulted her. But she has no actual proof. She only has her word and the physical evidence in the room.
And you suggested that it was more than just a sort of client relationship, that they'd seen each other before. Was there anything, do you think, romantic? Was there closeness between them? Obviously, on Penny's side, she was coming out of this abusive relationship. How about from Shane's side?
Definitely. I mean, he was a guy that fell in love. He's a romantic. And she was gorgeous. She understood. She'd also been a prostitute too, so she understood the world he was in. And they were forming a bond. They were speaking to each other outside of hours. She knew his real name. But the funny thing was that when she'd requested Shane to come, she had a very specific set of requests, that a young, blonde, Australian background, and that fitted Shane. So later on, I guess Shane started to feel like, well, was I being set up for something? And that was his defence at court, basically.
And you mentioned the vampire headline, which, you know, is something that any tabloid is going to grasp onto pretty tightly. Do you think in your research that he really thought he was a vampire?
No, not at all. I mean, he was reading, the fantasy books about vampires, the Twilight and all that kind of stuff that people were at the time. And so that was an appealing narrative to adopt, and he was a bit of a goth. That was his sort of shtick, long black coats, and he dyed his hair dark and this type of thing. So it fit with that. But no, he didn't. He was out of work. He was a down-to-earth, very grounded character. And no, he didn't believe he was a vampire.
So when Shane is charged and he's brought in by police to be questioned, and that would be pretty damning. You've seen this woman that night. There's pretty clear evidence of that. Where did he start with his defence? He denied that he'd done it. What did he say he had done that night?
He'd just come there and performed the services that he was requested to do so. But early on, there was a moment where she said to him, allegedly, "You're in danger. That I'm warning you now that I'm part of some snuff movie ring, and tonight someone's going to come in here and murder you after we have sex." And I guess he was alarmed, but not alarmed enough to leave. So after that, they proceeded to go into their thing and use various devices and things, but it was nothing more than he would normally do. And then a bit of sort of progression in the earlier visits. So this was now getting towards more the BDSM, but nothing like the injuries that she did suffer.
And what did he do afterwards? Because you talk in the podcast about how if you're someone who doesn't know a lot about this community, then you might look at it and think it's pretty damning. Because after he saw Penny, he didn't go straight home. What did he do instead that night?
He went to a brothel called the Main Course, which is not far away from where he was, and asked for a series of pretty degrading services I won't go into for your podcast, but again in the BDSM line. And some things, including butting a cigarette out on him, she wouldn't even do. But he did that, and people are shocked by that. But his lawyer told me, he explained to him like saying, well, that's just like anybody else going for a drink after work. I unwind by doing that. So we're dealing in a very different world, but to him it was quite normal.
And so he's been charged and is going to have to face court. Did he have, in the lead up to that appearance, any fears for his safety that he articulated to anyone around him?
He was increasingly afraid for his well-being and safety. He believed the police had set him up, and there was evidence that some pieces of evidence had been planted, including Penny's phone in his bag. So he felt they were about to railroad him into this case. And so he believed that people were following him. He believed that when he was at court, people were eyeing him, they were saying things to him. And he told Sandra Gibson, his friend from the Prostitutes Collective, that he believed he was going to be killed. And in fact, on the night before he was killed, he said, "Look at those policemen over there. They're looking at me, and people have been following me. I'm going to be killed. If I don't come tomorrow, you know what's happened." And she said, no, nothing. That's not going to happen. That doesn't happen in Melbourne, Victoria. But of course, that's exactly what did happen.
Did he say why he thought police were threatening him or why they would have set him up?
Well, he believed Penny was part of a high-level conspiracy, a sex ring that included judges, politicians, ranking police officers, crooks. And I guess there's one of those sort of conspiracy theories in most cities. But he strongly believed it. And when Sandra Gibson saw the way the police were regarding him, she thought there might have been something to it because he was genuinely afraid. So he was convinced that they were going to rub him out before he could get in the box, because the following day he was set to give evidence. His counsel had suggested against it. Mostly they do. But he said, no, I've got to tell my story about what happened in there and what forces were connected to Penny. So whether people knew that, I don't really know, but certainly he never got to give his evidence.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Walkley Award-winning investigative journalist Adam Shand about the unsolved murder of Melbourne's vampire gigolo, Shane Chartres-Abbott. So what actually happened on the morning that he woke up to go to court, put on his suit? What took place outside his home?
First, he went to the police station to report on bail. He came back, was getting ready to go to town for the court appearance. His dogs were barking, and they only bark when someone's outside. But he thought, no, nothing out there, it's cool, fine. So he leaves there with his girlfriend and his girlfriend's father, and two men run up from the side and grab him and shot him, once in the neck and once through the chest, and killed him on the spot.
And what were the initial leads in terms of who might have done this? Was there any evidence left at the scene that tied anyone to that crime?
No, there wasn't. There was quite good eyewitness descriptions, which gave an idea of what they were wearing, how they were covering their faces. They weren't wearing balaclavas. One had a sort of a scarf over his face. The other had pulled up a roll neck jumper. And there was a pretty good physical description of these guys and which way they'd run off and so forth. But without a face and without a suspect, there was not a lot to go on at the beginning.
Was there anyone who hated Shane, or you mentioned before that Penny was sort of in this on and off relationship with a guy who maybe was a bit of a crook? Was there any suggestion that he might be involved?
The man with the motive was Mark Adrian Perry. And shortly after the murder, Crime Stoppers took a call from a guy called Max Walker, who was a car dealer at times. He was also a dealer of drugs for Mark Adrian Perry. And he related conversations that he'd been a party to or witness to where Perry had sworn he was going to get Shane Chartres-Abbott for what he'd done to Penny. And there was another guy, also we can't name, who heard these conversations and was going to be a part of this thing. But he was concerned because they had a thriving drug business at the time, selling pills into clubs and so on and so forth. So he thought, well, this is just an obsession that's going to ruin our business. So he was against it. But Max Walker called Crime Stoppers and gave a report, but it wasn't really followed up, sadly.
Why do you think it wasn't followed up?
I don't know. You'll have to ask Victoria Police that.
And a few years passed and they've not solved this crime. As you say, it's unprecedented for someone to be shot on their way to court. Eventually, there was a confession that emerged from inside a prison. What did that person say?
It began in 2005, in fact, where a prisoner who was serving a sentence for murder, we can't name him for legal reasons, I call him the author because he's such a good storyteller. And he was in an interview about another matter, and he reached over and opened his palm to the police officer and said vampire on his hand. And immediately the police officer thought, well, that's got to be Shane Chartres-Abbott. And what he was doing was just testing the waters there to see what he could get for telling a story. A year passed, he was ready to talk. And he told a story about how he had killed Chartres-Abbott on behalf of Mark Adrian Perry through an intermediary, and had done it simply as a favour. This guy was a paid hitman, by the way, and you kill people for money. You don't do favours. You don't do freebies in that business, in my experience. But he said it was a favour because Shane was an animal who'd done these terrible things, including to other people he knew, which was also false. And police also were given a massive incentive to believe his confession. He was saying that a past police officer and a serving officer, plus others, had been involved in a conspiracy to set up Shane Chartres-Abbott. So this set off the most expensive investigation in Victoria Police's history. $30 million was spent trying to stand up these pretty vague assertions on behalf of the author. And I think anyone who knew the author knew he was an inveterate liar and should never have been taken seriously. But because there was a chance now to find the nexus between the gangland war and corrupt Victoria Police, it consumed the leadership of Victoria Police, including Deputy Commissioner Simon Overland. And he was in the midst then of a terrible gangland war. They had no leads. They were way, way behind. Carl Williams was laughing at them. So to have this confession was manna from heaven, and they were prepared to stand it up no matter what.
Did that confession align with evidence at the scene, with other eyewitness accounts? Did it look like it could be quite a solid lead?
It looked impossible from the beginning. It looked like a confession that had been cribbed from news reports from the Herald Sun and the Age. That's exactly how it was cobbled together. But they put those doubts aside and set about helping the author stand his story up. And we've subsequently discovered the involvement of another key player in this, Nicola Gobbo, Lawyer X. She was the author's counsel and was essentially recruited as a secret agent to go around and talk to some of the suspects who she already knew and had friendships with and had been a lawyer for, to get information that would help the author stand up his story better. That's what she did. And so over 6 years, these statements evolved. This is just unprecedented, you know. The best confession you'll ever get is the one on the first day. The one you've got to spend 6 years cobbling together really has a lot of holes, a lot of problems, you know. It's made of Swiss cheese. And this is exactly what the case was. I mean, so many things like he claimed to have been doing surveillance on Shane's house from a railway car park at the end of the street. And the problem was there was a 5-story building in between that spot, so he couldn't have seen them. He got his own apparel wrong from the description. He claimed to be wearing what the other accomplice was wearing. There were so many holes. I could spend all day on that. But police had such a big incentive to believe it.
What was in it for the author? Was it that if he dobbed on these people, he could have had a shortened sentence, or did he just like being listened to? Like, why would someone confess to a crime they hadn't committed?
He was serving a life sentence and was probably never going to be released, would never get parole. So guys in that situation, they like to exercise power. They like to get people to run around and they like to make court appearances and they like to be taken seriously. He also had some scores to settle. A very vindictive guy. He had some scores to settle with these policemen that he knew. And he was also being given incentives. He was told that he wouldn't spend an extra day in prison for Shane's murder. He would also get a tax bill waived. He would have property seizures foregone. He had a range of incentives to do this. And none of them seemed to be contingent upon telling the truth. It was just about getting a result. And I think that was the whole tone of the time. You saw Victoria Police at that time. It was all about ends, not means. I'd witnessed these court cases going through from about 2006 till after 2010, where these bogus witnesses would walk into the witness box there and tell whatever story the police needed. And the judiciary, senior police, a lot of the media were all complicit. And the quality of justice was just destroyed, as we've seen in the Lawyer X case. And really, Shane's case is just one part of that overall cultural problem we've seen in the Lawyer X scenario that's never been put right. And there won't be people walking out of jail for that one. And I don't think the right people at this stage will ever be charged or found guilty of, shall we say, because one was charged but acquitted. But we're very careful there. But I don't think that they will ever want to clean that mistake up. That's the problem.
And Mark Perry, the former partner of Penny, he becomes implicated in what went down. He is eventually arrested. What had he been doing from the time of the attack on Shane to being arrested? Had police been interviewing him? Had they been surveying him?
You think you would, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
You think you've got a very good eyewitness account of Perry talking about a conspiracy to murder Shane Chartres-Abbott from Max Walker, I told you before. You think you'd go and speak to the suspect. They didn't. They put him under surveillance. They bugged his house, bugged his car, followed him around, never spoke to him. Very strange. To the point where there was one ridiculous scene where they'd bugged his house and they put on a press conference announcing aspects of the case. And they sat there listening to this. They knew they were being bugged, so they sat there just being quiet. And this was Perry and the alleged accomplice, who's never been charged or spoken to. And so as things got a bit hotter, Perry decided to leg it. And he'd had deep and long-standing associations in Thailand. And so police thought he'd gone up there. He hadn't. He'd just gone to Perth. He went off the map, went off the grid, and it took him years to actually find him in Perth. Just living quietly, gone off the grid, didn't have a mobile phone, working in a restaurant, working in a local factory when he was finally caught, just waiting to be arrested. But police never came until finally he befriended someone that he'd known in Melbourne, in Perth, and talked about it to her and gave some pretty broad hints that he'd been involved. So she went to the police, I think, to claim the reward that was out for him at that stage. And he was finally caught and brought back to Melbourne.
It's almost like at that point you want to be caught after that long, and to actually talk to someone openly about it is an interesting thing for someone to do. What happened in the courtroom when he's put on trial? What came out about him?
Well, the key thing was that the author had to go in there and tell his story, which would have implicated Mark Perry as being the man who commissioned the hit, not the actual shooter. But when it came time to leave his cell, the author didn't want to go. He was unhappy with various inducements that he'd claimed he'd been offered and hadn't been given, and just didn't want to do it. So he was coaxed out of his cell to do a video link, and he basically fell off his story. He went from claiming that Mark Perry's associate had told him that he wanted him to murder Chartres-Abbott to just sort of giving him a good beating. It's so critical when you've got a commissioned hit that you have a very specific set of instructions that link the person who commissions it to the person who does it. And that was completely gone. So the case collapsed spectacularly after $30 million. And the point was that the prosecution went into that case with 26 separate exculpatory pieces of evidence that they ignored. So they were prepared to accept the author's confession no matter what. So in the end, all the accused were acquitted, and the only one who's ever been found guilty of the murder of Shane was the man who made it up, the author.
And Mark Perry, he allegedly told people he'd done it, right? There are some people who say that he was quite upfront about his involvement in it. Was that evidence not damning enough?
Well, Penny finally, after years, was taken to the Australian Crime Commission and basically threatened with jail about what she knew about Shane's death. And she recounted a story that she'd met Perry in a downtown pub in Melbourne, and he had told her that he personally had killed Shane. And he'd even showed her what he did, grabbing her around the neck and putting his fingers like a gun against her throat. And it completely coincided with the forensics of the murder of Shane, whereas what the author had told people was completely bogus. And they knew from the beginning. He said he'd walked up to Shane and from a distance of about 2 feet fired somewhere into the mass and then fired again on his way down. But none of that was supported by the forensics, because if you're 2 feet away, there's no powder burns on a wound. Both of the wounds had intense stippling around the wound, like a tattoo almost, from the powder burn, which tells you that the shot was delivered from very close and the trajectory of the bullet was upwards, so through the neck and into the top of the cavity in the head and the skull. So that, again, perfectly matched the way that Mark Perry had told Penny that he'd done it. So, again, this was sort of discounted. So you had a very ridiculous situation in the courtroom. You had two versions of how Shane was killed by two different people, and they were both on trial in the same court. And this is a very common instance in criminal trials where two co-accused will essentially accuse each other to confuse the jury and to create reasonable doubt for each other, which is what happened. And it was more than reasonable. There was obvious doubt about both stories. So the jury had no choice but to acquit them all.
And how about the allegation of police corruption? Was that completely thrown out, or was there still ongoing speculation that there could have been police involved somehow?
Sure, listen, the author came up with this big story that he'd met with police beforehand in a certain pub, and he'd been given the address for Shane Chartres-Abbott. He'd been basically given a green light. He'd given a bribe to someone for this information. Then he went and killed Chartres-Abbott. He then gave the gun to an ex-policeman called David Waters, who then kept it for a couple of days, gave it back to the author for some reason, who then threw it in the bay at Geelong. And this was so bogus from the beginning because Waters had a perfectly plausible alibi for the morning he was supposed to have done this. And when that was presented to the author, he just changed the day. And again, he had another alibi for that as well. So it was clear that he hadn't been involved. And so there you have one of the key conspirators, supposedly in the Crown's case, facilitating the provision of the address, hiding the murder weapon and so forth. He was never charged, yet the allegations were still run in the court. It's such a denial of natural justice. I was astounded by it. And it just shows the disorganisation of the Crown case and how the author had just run rings about everybody at this stage. So David Waters and his friend Peter Lawler, who was the man who was supposedly given a bribe to go into the LEAP system, which the police use for various details, and extract the address. And it was shown that anybody could have got Shane's address from electoral records and things. There was one ridiculous moment where it was found that a worker in the tax office in Albury had accessed Shane's details before the murder. And all it was this true crime buff had seen the vampire rape story and gone in and checked who the dude was. And he had a little book he was filling out birthdays, and this was part of a long and unavailing decision to try to implicate other police, because there was an ex-Victoria policeman who knew the other police who was on the site in Albury. It just got ridiculous. So the lengths to which the Victoria police went to, and now we see why. The whole Lawyer X story tells you why they were going to such lengths to stand these stories up, because their credibility and their possible liberty in the future, let's not mince words here, still the leadership of Victoria Police at the time is not out of the woods. The Lawyer X Royal Commission has shown how they went to extraordinary lengths, even to the point of perverting the course of justice, to get these convictions. And I think that's a continuing stain on justice in Victoria.
Well, that's the thing, is that you've got a woman who was violently assaulted who didn't have a conviction, because Shane was, of course, killed before his court date. And then for Shane's family and people who loved him, they have not seen justice because there's been no conviction for the person guilty of that. Lastly, I wanted to ask you, do you think that that will ever be rectified? With all that money, with all those resources, do you think someone will ever go to jail for what they did to Shane?
I'd like to think so. And I have some cunning plans left to make that happen, to be honest. I'm working on those right now, as a matter of fact. I think it's all about the author, because he could tomorrow decide to tell the truth and then just crater the whole prosecution, as ridiculous as it was, and tell the truth of what happened, the fact he had no involvement whatsoever. And he never met Mark Adrian Perry. He'd never been involved with the ex-police in the way that he claimed to. He could do it tomorrow. He has nothing left to live for. I don't know why he doesn't do it. I write to him from time to time, just explaining why he should do this, explaining how Shane's family just needs some justice. And that's why I call the podcast The Trials of the Vampire, because he's been through the whole legal system in different ways. He still stalks the halls of justice in Victoria in a way, And I think there could be a resolution eventually. I'd like to see that, because, he's just cast as this villain, and he was nothing like that. I don't think he'd have even been convicted of that rape, because the doubt was there in the evidence, and the police had done the wrong thing. They'd allegedly planted Penny's phone in his bag because they didn't have enough evidence. They had to have some motive as to why he would do this ridiculous thing during a paid-for-sex session. So, yeah, I'm hoping there's still a chance. And, while there's still breath in my body, I'm working on it, because I've been doing this story, for 18 years? So you don't stop.
Adam Shand is a Walkley Award-winning investigative journalist with over 35 years' experience. He hosts Channel 9's Australian True Crime Stories, as well as a number of his own true crime podcasts. You can find his podcast, The Trials of the Vampire, by following the link in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.